Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Let's Have Renaissance, a podcast about writing, editing, publishing, literature, the arts, and more. I am Ito Utini.
And I'm Makaya Utini, and today we're speaking with Armand Rosamilia. Armand has written and published over 200 stories, including crime thrillers, supernatural thrillers, zombies, contemporary fiction, nonfiction, and more. In this episode, he shares insights he's gleaned from a long career in writing and publishing, including the red flags he's learned to avoid in book contracts. We're excited to be with him today. First-time listeners, welcome. We're glad you're here. We're building a community of writers and artists from all walks of life, and since you're with us on this journey, we'd appreciate if you would like, comment, subscribe to the channel, and spread the word. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover, or a guest you want us to bring on, please let us know. And for more free resources, check out the Datekeepers blog at thedatekeepers.com/blog. Thank you.
Armand, thank you so much for joining us today. We're excited to have you. Can you please tell us about yourself?
Sure. Armand Rosamilia. I am a full-time crime, fiction, and horror author. I've been able to live off of this career for 14 years now. I'm a New Jersey boy. I've been down in Florida for the past 24 years. It's much nicer down here, especially with the weather.
Do you miss the cold or no?
No, I mean, it's cold. It's cold here. It's 60 degrees here in Jacksonville, Florida. My blood is so thin now. It feels like 10 below.
What brought you down there?
We had just had our third kid. I was married at the time, and my brother was down here near the Daytona Beach area, and he loved it. And he's like, come down and see if you just hang out. And I came down and immediately applied and got a job and ended up moving the family down here.
What was the job?
I have always been in retail management. And I swore when I came down here, I was not going to do that. I was going to do something else. And of course, then I became a footwear manager for JCPenney.
Do you find that enriches your fiction in any way? Because you can always draw on material directly, but then there's also just the value of intense boredom that you can get in some jobs. And then I'm sure there's other indirect ways in which a career that doesn't seem to be related to writing does enrich your work. Have you noticed that?
Being in retail management for 20-something years, I disliked every moment of it. A lot of the people that worked with me, a lot of upper management, all of the customers, a lot of those people come up in stories all the time.
Okay, so that explains why crime, why thriller. It makes sense now. Have you ever dabbled in other genres?
Yeah, I've written a bunch of different stuff. I've done supernatural thrillers. I've done several nonfiction books. I ghost wrote a military romance once. I just finished co-writing a post-apocalyptic romance with somebody. I've probably done it all 30-something years of being published. I've written science fiction. I've written fantasy. So I've written a lot of different genres.
Can you talk about co-authoring? A lot of people, especially in the writing world, when you think about a writer, you always imagine someone in their room with their desk and pen and paper or computer or whatever, and, isolated. Can you share about your experience co-authoring with someone? What was that like?
I've actually done it probably about 7 or 8 times now with different authors over the years. And it usually starts out with just having a conversation with another author. So a good friend of mine, she is a romance author. And we were hanging out one day and she said, I would love to write a post-apocalyptic romance. That seems to be pretty big right now. And I said, well, I've written a zombie series. I've written post-apocalyptic books. I said, but except for ghostwriting one romance, I said, I've never done that. I said, let's kind of see if we can work this together. And it was interesting because she is a planner. So she's like, well, we need all this out. And I'm like, I'm a pantser. I'm just going to write. You could put something together for you, but I'm not going to follow it. That's not my style. Once I've written, it out like that, it feels like I've written the book. And we knocked it off in probably, 60-something thousand words, probably in about a month. And it was a lot of fun because when we got to the points when, okay, we're going to have some sex coming up. Okay, well, you write that part, and then I'll write some more of the post-apocalyptic stuff. So we mixed it up, and we wrote to our strengths in that. And I think that's what it is. To me, it makes me a better writer. I look at what they've written, especially a lot of times it's just you write a chapter, I write a chapter. Somebody might write 2 chapters in a row, but generally we're going back and forth with no real idea of where we're going. We just kind of, you just kind of wing it, and you throw ideas back and forth. And I'm like, all right, well, that's act 1. All right, well, we're into act 2. So after writing so many stories in my career, I can kind of cheat my way through it anyway and know where we are in the story without even having, sometimes they'll even look at a word count.
When you're working with another writer, do you find that you have to spend a lot of time in the editorial process working through the manuscript and creating a voice that is coherent and it doesn't sound like either you or your collaborator, or does that happen naturally? And I'm curious about this because we collaborate on all of our fiction, and it's interesting to speak with other people who have co-written fiction. And I'm also thinking, I recently read a biography of Borges, and he and a friend of his collaborated on a series of detective novels and talked about how the character of the narrator, and then it was a first person narration, so the narrative voice, it was not either of the author's voices. It was a third creature that just sort of manifested between them, and then it got away from them, and it started doing things that neither one of them wanted it to do, and it became increasingly difficult to sell the books in the series because their narrator was so unruly. So it's interesting how sometimes that happens organically, but also sometimes it looks like it happened organically, but there's a lot of work that goes into that behind the scenes. So how has that worked for you in your different collaborative partnerships?
I've been very fortunate because I've collaborated with authors that have the same basic style that I do. I tried a couple times where somebody was more of a literary writer. I consider myself a pulp fiction writer. I just want to tell a good story without having to use a lot of big words and make the reader have to, pull out a thesaurus every few pages. And that doesn't work. We've had a couple that I'm like, we can't find a middle ground. You can tell who's writing which chapter, and it doesn't work that way. I'm also very big on, you've written a chapter, and then I'm going to go through and I'm going to edit through that chapter. And sometimes I'm like, hey, this isn't kind of what we planned on or what I'm thinking, but we're going to go with it. And I'm trying to just how I would write it, but then they do the same thing. And so every line is touchable, and it's not a ton of rewrites anyway. It's usually minor stuff. I'm writing a trilogy now with author Tom Duffy, and this will be our fourth trilogy we've written together in the last couple of years. And in the book, one of the gentlemen, his name is Terrence. He's an older gentleman. He's Terrence. And Tom kept writing Terry. And I finally just said to him, stop calling this guy Terry. His name is Terrence. Give him some respect, He's an old man named Terrence. Leave it at Terry. And it's like just, little stuff like that is funny, but we never get to where we're like, no, this doesn't work or that doesn't work. A lot of times I'll write a chapter and I'm like, all right, let's see what he does with this. Let's see what the other author does with it. Here's my idea, but I'm not going to lead you to that. And that's really the challenge, the fun, because then they'll write something completely different, or they might kill that character or whatever. And for me, that's the fun. Now, the challenge was writing a post-apocalyptic romance because there are beats that you have to hit. And I'm writing that book like I'm writing a post-apocalyptic book. And so I'm throwing some curveballs and some twists. And she's like, no. We don't need all these twists. We just need the romance reader knows what they're looking for. We just have to give them that. And that was a bigger challenge for me when I was writing.
You have written over 200 stories. Can you tell us about your first story that you wrote, and what mistakes did you make, and what did you learn while working on your first story?
So my first published short story was called Beastie, and I had that published in 1988. I was a senior in high school. And I think I got a contributor copy for it. And I immediately, I knew from there I was going to be buying yachts within 6 months. I was going to be a billionaire at that point.
For sure.
And I actually added it into, I think, my first short story collection. Every year on my birthday, I put out another short story collection, and it captures 30 something years of stories. It could be something I wrote yesterday for the collection. It could be, Beastie that I wrote 30 something years ago. And I did not edit the story. I left it as is, as 18-year-old me had written that story. And it's not a great story, but it definitely shows that some progress was being made. I wrote a ton of stories in the 90s and I had them published in zines. And I'm glad none of those stories exist anymore because I know they were just all awful. You write your first million words and you throw them away kind of thing. And I see now in this day and age, and I'm going to sound like an old man, which I am, people are writing their first stories and then they're just immediately putting them up on Amazon. And I always say to them, the goal is in 5 years for you to be embarrassed by that story, for you to hate that story because you've gotten so much better in your writing. And if 5 years from now you still go, hey, that's still a great story, maybe this writing thing isn't for you.
That's very good advice. I think a lot of people need to hear that. It's difficult because a lot of people are eager to get their work out there and show it to people and be like, hey, Ma, look what I did. But there is a value in exercising patience, especially now that we have all these options that are I guess they technically qualify as publishing, but they're not curated in any way. If you just throw something out on your blog, throw something out on a social media platform, people can read it, but there's not that process of filtering that forces you to think and rethink and get better. So for our listeners who either are not writers or write in other genres, non-commercial genres, can you talk about what commercial publishing is like? Like, what is that process from A to Z, from when you first conceive of what the next story is going to be to getting your book on the shelf? Can you walk us through that process?
Sure. So I do self-publishing and then I also work with presses. And a lot of the time when I come up with the initial idea for a story, I kind of have it in my head. Okay, am I going to self-publish this? Am I going to look for a publisher, or I'll have a publisher already in mind, and I'll say, you know what, I want to write something for that publisher. And so so there's a company, small press called Severed Press. They're based in the UK, and they want monsters. And so I came up with this idea for this giant monster, a Godzilla type of thing, like a kaiju. And it basically, the whole concept is it breaks free of mountains in Russia and it walks across the Pacific Ocean and then it beats the crap out of San Francisco. That's the whole idea. And I knew they only wanted like a novella. They wanted like 30,000 words. So I wrote that specifically for them. They took it. And I'm actually working on my 12th book with them now and all different kinds of monsters. And basically, like, I'll say, all right, you tell me what monsters you want and I'll write that book. They're like, well, we could use another couple of Bigfoot books. Okay, I'll come up with a couple of Bigfoot books. So, that's one way of doing it for me. And then a lot of times it's like, hey, I have an idea and maybe it's a little bit different. It's not as commercial as I think it's going to be. And I also want to keep my stuff. I want to keep, my self-published stuff out there. The ideal for anything is every 28 days. That's the algorithm. That's Amazon. If you have a release every 28 days, which is absolutely ridiculous to pump out that much stuff, but that also takes into account short stories that are released in anthologies, as long as your name is credited in that book on Amazon. So, I'm kind of all over the place with it as far as sometimes I'll just sit down and I'll go, you know what, I have an idea for a short story and I just want to write this story. And I don't care how many words it is. I just want to finish it. And this could be a story for my Patreon, or this could be a story for my short story collection at the end of the year. I just have this idea and I just want to get it out. And, then maybe I'll look for a publisher. I have a list of the different publishers that are, looking for different things in anthologies. But for the most part, a lot of it is I'm doing the self-publishing because then I can pick the date. I can find the cover artist. I can get the formatting done. My editor, I have all of that in place from doing this. I have a couple dozen beta readers I can throw books at to read and things. That's the fun of it. The fun of it is every story is going to be set up a little bit different. Every story is going to be written a little different. I've had stories where I've sat down and written an entire book in like 20 days. And then I've had books that it took me 10 years to finish that. So, I think if I got to the point where I was like, okay, I know I can write exactly X number of words every day and I can put out X number of books on these dates every year, I think that would get boring.
If you were to share 5 or 10 things that someone has to have in order to successfully self-publish, what are those?
Know your limits, I think, is the first one. I see way too many um, new authors who think, well, I can figure out the formatting. I don't need an editor. I see that one a lot, which is ridiculous because you could read your story 100 times and your brain processes it perfectly. You know what that needs to say. And there's words missing or there's typos or whatever. And you will never see that in a million years. So you need an editor. You need a really good cover artist. You can't say, "Hey, I'm gonna jump on Fiverr and somebody's gonna make me a $5 cover, or I'm gonna use AI and nobody's gonna notice," because everybody's gonna notice and you're killing your career. And so I think, the things that you do well, continue to do them. Learn the other things, but don't immediately go, "Well, I can figure this. I'll figure out Canva and I'll just make my own covers." No, because people know that's where you got your cover and you're shooting yourself in the foot to begin with. There's whatever they say, thousands of books released every day. So you just kind of get thrown out there and somebody looks at that bad cover or they read the sample and they see 5 spelling errors in the first chapter and then they skip your book because there's a million other books out there. I also think reading is really, really important. So read outside of your genre. Read your genre. Know your genre very well. Most of the stuff that I read is nonfiction. I read a ton of nonfiction books because it gives me ideas and it's not writing in my genre. So things aren't seeping into my brain, ideas or different things as I'm writing. Right now I'm writing a Southern Gothic noir thriller. And so I try to stay away from those in my own reading because I don't want any of that to bleed in. But I've read tons of those already. So I already know the tropes and the ideas. So I think that's also important as well.
Who are your favorite authors?
It depends on the day. I just read the second Ron Resch book, who is a Southern author, phenomenal. Jordan Harper, S.A. Cosby. Dean Koontz is the be all end all for me since I was 12 years old. He's the reason I'm a writer. And there's just so many really, really solid authors. And I'm always finding new ones and people are always throwing new ones in my way. Ron Rash was somebody who said, "Oh, if you like S.A. Cosby, maybe you could go back to the, early 2000s. I think you would like this guy." And they were right.
On your website, you mentioned your wife. Can you talk about how her support has enabled you to be the successful writer you are?
Yeah, no, definitely. I think somebody once said in an interview, "What is the best money you've ever spent in writing?" And I said, taking her on our first date. She is a commercial property manager, so she deals in numbers, spreadsheets and numbers and things like that. And when we first started dating, she's like, "How many words do you write?" And I'm like, "I don't know, a lot." "How much money do you make?" "I don't know, a lot." And she's like, "Well, don't you want to track it? Don't you want to see where you are?" So she made me spreadsheets, which I still use. We've been together 13 years now. A couple of days ago was our anniversary of our first date 13 years ago. We've been married for 10 years. And so she handles all of the money part of this. She helps me with the contracts. She knows what to expect now in contracts. So I'll get a contract in and I send it to her and I say, "Hey, look this over. Tell me what you think." And she'll find a couple of things. She's like, "Well, let's see if we can change this, this, and this." And I'm like, "Okay," because I'll just sign it. Let's move on. And so it really, really helps. And it also really helps to ground me because I've had some really, really good contracts. I'm blessed. I've had some big money. I'm able to do this full time. And I kind of get full of myself sometimes. And she's like, "Oh, that's great. That's really good money. We could pay off a couple credit cards with that." Blah, blah. She's like, "In the meantime, did you take the garbage out?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'll go take the garbage out."
What are the things that you've learned to look for or that you've learned that your wife often looks for and flags in contracts that you know to look out for?
One of my biggest, and this is because back in 2009, one of my novellas, it was actually my first for years I'd only written short stories, and it was a novella called Death Metal. And I got a publisher and, signed the contract. This is way before I'd met my wife. And when the book came out, the cover was awful. I mean, it was like this, it's death metal. And it was a dude with a mohawk playing keyboards. And it was just, there was nothing heavy metal about the cover at all. And I said to the publisher, I was like, well, I didn't agree to this. And they're like, well, it's not in the contract. We just basically, we can do whatever we want. And they also edited it without me going over the edits. And I knew right then, I'm like, you know what, I don't want to do this. So when I'm sitting down and signing a contract now, I want to make sure I have the final say on edits and I have the final say on the cover artwork. I walked away from a couple of contracts when they said, well, no, we're not going to do that. And I said, okay, well, then I'm not going to work with you. And I've also had publishers that have come to me wanting, hey, do you have a book? And then I'll look at their covers and I'm like, no, these covers are awful. I don't want to be, and I've had some bad covers. I mean, I got 230 releases or whatever it is on Amazon. So I've had some bad covers. But for me, those are sticking points. I want to make sure that I'm putting my best foot forward and I have control over that. I want to make sure you're not just going to throw the book up there without an edit, or you're going to do an edit without me. Because a lot of times it's names of things, or it's certain things that I'm writing about. Like I'm writing about stuff from New Jersey or Jacksonville, Florida. Then there's words or sayings or things that somebody from there, it will make sense. And a lot of times those are the initial edits. It's like, well, this doesn't make sense. And I'm like, no, it does. We're not changing that. And then I explain why. And if I don't have that, they're just going to change it. And then it just changes the entire meaning of the story.
So we always ask our guests to read an excerpt from their work at the end of the interview. So if you'd like to read, now's the time.
Sure. So I have a short story that is in my latest release, which is called Is This Light Painted? And it is my 6th short story collection. And in my collections, I always do crime fiction, I'll do horror, I'll do zombies, I do fantasy, I'll do science fiction, whatever. I want to make sure at some point there's a collection of every short story, whether it's been published or not, is together on my shelf. So that's kind of what it is. Let me read you one of the stories that's in this newest collection. It's called Corner Lot. You wouldn't know to look at the overgrown corner lot, but there's a house there. Behind the tulip trees, silver bells, black spruces, and red oaks, shielded by the bearberries, mountain laurels, and northern bayberry, covered by pretty black-eyed Susans and trumpet honeysuckle, a 2-story wood and concrete structure stands. I've lived at 251 Center Avenue since the day I was born. 50 years. Just me and Mama. The day I was brought home from the hospital, and I was born in nearby Red Bank, I never left. Homeschooled from the beginning. My mama had what now would be diagnosed as schizophrenia. A touch of bipolar and paranoia, too. All undiagnosed because we never left the property. Would you believe before I stepped onto the overgrown lot across the street, I'd never even ventured onto the asphalt of Center Avenue itself? You might be thinking, this poor, poor woman never saw the world, never got to meet anyone or do anything with her life. I would wholeheartedly disagree. See, I got a better education than the public school kids. I got one-on-one teaching. And then when the computer age came along, it opened up a world to explore. Maybe I didn't travel to Italy or New York City physically, but I was there. I read everything I could get my hands on. Mama ordered crates of used books for me. I walked the streets of Chicago using Google Earth. I devoured documentaries on Netflix and listened to history and true crime podcasts. I was never interested in fiction. I wanted to explore the real world, things that were explainable, things that happened, which is why the overgrown lot across the street was a puzzle. In 1974, I believe it was either June or July, I do remember it was warm, even for summer. The first boy went missing. I've gone back through the online archives of the Asbury Park Press as well as the New York Times. No mention is made before that summer. The house had been exquisite in her heyday, back when the rich from Manhattan drove down in their fancy cars for a quiet shore getaway. It was owned by a Hungarian family. Mama said they were prone to loud violence, and you always knew when they were down for a week or two. They'd throw wild parties, drink alcohol, dance to loud music. By the time I was old enough to understand, the parties had stopped. The house was quiet. Every now and then I'd spy a light on in the home, a shadow moving around, a car or two in the driveway, but nothing out of the ordinary. That came later. When I was 12 in 1983, the vehicles stopped coming. Our little seaside town was no longer a getaway spot for the New York elite. I had no idea back then because there was no computer or Google Earth to allow me to walk the streets, but our seaside hamlet was shrinking, fading away one lot at a time. Near the bay, several homes had been destroyed by a nor'easter. Another half dozen by the bulldozer to clear the area for condominiums that would never rise over the water. The house across the street on the corner lot was silent. The grass had begun to grow higher, a foot tall in places. The weeds began their choking march across the property, too. Later, I'd learned the original family had died out and another family, these people also Hungarian, had purchased it. Perhaps with the intent of rebuilding or tearing it down. The lot was nearly a square acre, a throwback to when the houses in our town weren't built on top of one another, parcels cut into fourths and sold. I spent my teen years in my own tiny world learning, staying busy, content. By then, Mama had inherited her parents' estate. She'd also been receiving child support for me from my absent father. I knew I could easily find him online, but the thought of it made me sad. What if he had a new, better daughter he doted on? Took her to Keensburg Amusement Park. Great adventure, a trip to Disney in Florida. I couldn't stand the thought of being robbed of these actual trips, so I pushed it aside. Butterfly weed was the first perennial I identified across the street, and it hosted such beautiful monarch caterpillars, and later, of course, butterflies, that it brought me to tears. I've never cried so much, and even when Mama passed, I shed tears, but nothing as emotional. It was also the same week another little boy went missing. I remember the police searched the property, but by then the weeds had overtaken the grass. Almost overnight, the mix of trees had begun to grow as well. A wall of shrubbery, long rows of flowers, and a seemingly impenetrable wall of thorns had sprung up, blocking the property from a casual onlooker. I never dated a boy or later a man. Yes, I had plenty of online suitors. I even toured with one of those dating apps when you swipe left, or was it right? But the thought of having someone on my block in my home touching me, no thank you. Studies took up most of my adult life. I love biology. I took online courses from several colleges about autopsies, taxidermy, botany, and the like. I wanted to know how the human body worked, what made us tick. I wanted to know about the plant life growing so wildly across the street. Why had someone never complained about the lot? Reading through local news feeds and message boards, this town was filled with busybodies who pointed out every little thing their neighbors did. A fourth boy went missing. Then another two, all the year before my mama died. By then, Mama was frail. She rarely ventured to the front porch to crochet or stare across the street. It'll be gone soon, the house, the signs of mankind, the bodies, she'd say, given back to the earth where it all belongs. At the time, I didn't understand her. Now I most certainly do. When she died peacefully in her sleep, I didn't bother calling the authorities. They wouldn't know what her last wish was, but I did. The house and the bank accounts were all in my name. I made sure we were fed, with weekly food deliveries from A&P. Pizza on Friday night, the driver leaving the box on the tray near the door where he'd find his generous tip. Mama died on a Friday night. She wasn't feeling so well, so I ate her half of her pepperoni and onion pizza too. We'd never ate leftover. Besides, Saturday was always ham and cheese sandwiches for lunch and meatloaf for dinner. I took her across the street 2 minutes to midnight on Saturday, right after I've gotten everything in order. Her clothes, her books, her personal items. I've been the cook for us for years. I cleaned the dishes, made sure I had all of the ingredients for pasta on Sunday. I'd need to cut the food in half now that she was gone. Mama wasn't heavy in my arms. I walked onto the pavement and it was an odd feeling. Across to the corner lot where the pin oaks parted, careful not to drop their acorns on us. The northern spice bush pulled back, clearing my path to the house. Inside I went, as if I'd been here before, through the rooms and into the basement, the door long gone. Mama had told me every step as I got older, the tasks that needed to be done. I would take over her guardianship of the corner lot, keep it free of invading children who'd grow up and graffiti the walls, leave empty beer cans and cigarette butts. There was a shovel in the corner and a crudely drawn map of the burial locations. Mama had already marked where she wanted to be, in the direct center of the basement, overlooking her work, overlooking my new work yet to come.
Thank you. Ooh.
Very nice. All right. Thank you so much, Armand. That was fantastic. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Awesome. Thank you for your time.
Yep, thank you.